The autumn wind swept through the cobblestone streets of Ashford, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of hammers striking anvils. In the year of our Lord 1342, this modest town, nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests, was home to merchants, farmers and craftsmen who lived their lives in the shadow of the great castle that overlooked the valley. But this story does not begin in the castle, nor does it begin with nobles or lords. This story begins with a boy named Thomas, barely 10 years of age, whose eyes had seen more cruelty than most men witness in a lifetime. Thomas lived in a small cottage on the edge of town with his mother Eleanor and his stepfather Roderick. His real father, a kind blacksmith named William, had died 3 winters past from a fever that swept through the region, taking many good souls with it. Eleanor, left alone with a young son and no means to support them, had married Roderick within the year. It seemed a practical match at the time. Roderick was a tanner by trade, and though he was known to drink heavily at the tavern, Eleanor believed he would provide for them, and perhaps even show kindness to young Thomas. How wrong she had been. From the very first night Roderick moved into their cottage, the beatings began. At first, they were reserved for Eleanor, delivered behind closed doors when Thomas was supposed to be sleeping. But the boy heard everything through the thin walls, his mother's muffled cries, the sound of fists meeting flesh, the crash of furniture being overturned. Thomas would lie in his small bed, tears streaming down his face, feeling utterly helpless and terrified. He wanted to protect his mother, but he was just a child, small for his age, with arms that could barely lift a bucket of water. As the months passed, Roderick's violence escalated. He began to strike Thomas as well, sometimes for legitimate mistakes like spilling milk or tracking mud into the house, but more often for no reason at all, except that the man was drunk and angry at the world. The bruises on Thomas's arms and back became a permanent fixture, hidden beneath his rough wool tunic. At the village well, when the other children asked about a black eye or split lip, Thomas would lie and say he had fallen or been kicked by a horse. No one questioned it too closely. In those days, what happened within a man's household was considered his own business, and few would interfere between a stepfather and his stepson. Eleanor tried to shield Thomas as best she could, often putting herself between the boy and Roderick's rage. This only resulted in worse beatings for her. Thomas watched his mother, once a woman with a ready smile and bright eyes, slowly transform into a hollow shell of herself. She moved through the house like a ghost, her face perpetually downcast, her body covered in bruises that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. The light had gone out of her eyes, replaced by a dull acceptance of her fate. One particularly brutal evening in late autumn, Roderick came home from the tavern in a foul mood. He had lost money gambling with some travelling merchants and was looking for someone to blame. He started by shouting at Eleanor about the thin soup she had prepared for supper, then knocked the pot from the fire, sending the meagre meal spilling across the floor. When Thomas instinctively moved to help his mother clean up the mess, Roderick grabbed the boy by the hair and threw him against the wall with such force that Thomas saw stars. The man then proceeded to beat Eleanor with his belt until she collapsed on the floor, whimpering. That night, lying in his bed with his ribs aching from where Roderick had kicked him, Thomas made a decision. He could not live like this anymore. His mother could not live like this anymore. Something had to be done. But what could a small boy do against a grown man? He had no weapons, no strength, no authority. Who would listen to a child's complaints about his stepfather? The village priest might offer prayers, but no real help. The local bailiff was a friend of Roderick's and would likely dismiss any accusations as childish lies. As Thomas lay there in the darkness, he heard something that would change everything. Through his small window, he could hear voices in the street, rough and loud, accompanied by the sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones. He crept to the window and peered out into the moonlit night. What he saw made his heart race with a mixture of fear and strange hope. A group of knights had arrived in the village, but these were not the polished, noble knights who served lords in castles. These were the Brotherhood of the Road, a group of warrior knights who lived by their own code, traveling from town to town, taking odd jobs, settling disputes, and generally existing on the fringes of proper society. They were mercenaries of a sort, but with a reputation for a rough kind of justice. Common folk both feared and respected them. They wore mismatched armor, carried well-used weapons, and their horses were sturdy beasts built for long journeys rather than tournament grounds. Their leader, a man called Roland the Scarred, was legendary for his fairness in dealing with common people, though he was said to be absolutely merciless toward those who preyed on the weak. Thomas watched as the knights dismounted outside the village tavern, their armor clanking, their voices carrying through the still night air. They were laughing and joking with each other, clearly planning to spend the night drinking and resting before moving on to wherever their road led next. An idea began to form in Thomas's mind, desperate and dangerous, but perhaps his only chance. The next morning, before dawn had fully broken, Thomas slipped out of the cottage while Roderick snored off his drunkenness, and his mother slept fitfully in the corner where she had collapsed the night before. The boy made his way through the empty streets to the tavern where he had seen the knights. Several of their horses were tied outside, and he could see through the window that some of the men were already awake, breaking their fast with bread and ale. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door. What was he doing? These were dangerous men, warriors who killed for coin. They might laugh at him, or worse, they might tell Roderick what he had tried to do. But as he thought of his mother's broken face and the endless years of suffering that stretched ahead of them, he found his courage. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The tavern fell silent as the small boy entered. 6 pairs of hard eyes turned to look at him. The knights were seated around a large table, their weapons propped against the wall nearby, their armor showing the dents and scratches of countless battles. Roland the Scarred sat at the head of the table, and Thomas could immediately see how he had earned his name. A terrible scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek to his jaw, a memento from some long-ago fight. Despite the fearsome appearance, the man's eyes were surprisingly intelligent and assessing. Thomas stood there in the doorway, suddenly feeling very small and very foolish. One of the knights, a burly man with a red beard, laughed. "What's this? Has the tavern keeper hired children to serve us now?" The other knights chuckled, but Roland raised a hand for silence. He studied Thomas with those keen eyes, noting the fading bruises on the boy's face, the way he held himself protectively, the desperate look in his eyes. "Come here, boy," Roland said, his voice neither kind nor unkind, simply commanding. Thomas walked forward on shaking legs until he stood before the table. "Why do you seek us at this hour? What business could a child have with the Brotherhood of the Road?" Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Please, sirs, I need your help. My stepfather, he beats me and my mother every day, every night when he drinks. My mother is so hurt, and I am afraid he will kill her. I have no one else to turn to. I heard that you help people, that you make things right. Please, I am begging you." The knights exchanged glances. The red-bearded one shook his head. "Domestic troubles are not our concern, boy. We are not nursemaids or marriage counselors. Go speak to your priest." But Thomas, with the desperation of the truly helpless, pushed forward. "I will pay you. I have money saved, copper coins I have been hiding. It is not much, but it is all I have." He pulled out a small pouch from beneath his tunic and poured its contents on the table. A handful of copper pennies, perhaps enough to buy a decent meal. Certainly not enough to interest a group of mercenary knights. Another knight, this one lean and dark-haired, laughed bitterly. "Boy, do you know what we charge for our services? That would not pay for one of us for 1 hour. Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Then I will work for you. I will tend your horses, clean your armor, anything you need. Please just help us. I do not know what else to do. I thought about killing him myself, but I'm too small and weak. I thought about running away with my mother, but he would find us, and it would be worse. You are my last hope. Roland continued to study the boy in silence. The other knights shifted uncomfortably. They were hard men, accustomed to violence and death, but something about this child's desperate plea touched something in them that they thought they had long ago buried. Finally, Roland spoke. "What is your name, boy?" "Thomas, sir. Thomas the blacksmith's son." "And your stepfather's name?" "Roderick the tanner." At the mention of the name, one of the knights, an older man with grey in his beard, spat on the floor. "I know that one. Saw him in the tavern last night. Loud, boorish fellow, boasting about how he keeps his woman in line. Said some things that turned my stomach, truth be told." Roland nodded slowly, then looked back at Thomas. "Tell me true, boy, and think carefully before you answer. Are you asking us to kill your stepfather?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Thomas swallowed hard. This was the moment. This was what he had come here to do, was it not? To beg these warriors to end Roderick's life, to free him and his mother from their nightmare. But as he stood there, looking into Roland's scarred face, he realized something. He did not want to be responsible for a man's death, even Roderick's. He did not want that stain on his soul, but he did want the beatings to stop. He wanted his mother to be safe. He wanted to stop living in fear. "I want him to stop hurting us," Thomas said finally, his voice steadier now. "If that means killing him, then yes, I suppose that is what I am asking. But truly I just want him gone from our lives. I want my mother to be able to smile again. I want to stop being afraid every moment of every day." Roland leaned back in his chair, stroking his scarred chin thoughtfully. The other knights waited for their leader to speak, to make the decision. After what felt like an eternity, Roland stood up. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and intimidating, but his voice when he spoke was measured and calm. "We will look into this matter, Thomas, son of William, but understand this: we do not simply take coin and kill whomever we are pointed at. We follow our own code. We will observe this, Roderick, see for ourselves if what you say is true. If we find that you have lied to us, if this is some childish revenge for a deserved punishment, you will face consequences. But if we find that you speak truth, if this man is indeed the monster you describe, then we will handle it in our way, not necessarily by killing him, but by ensuring he never raises a hand to you or your mother again. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. You will see that I speak the truth. Return to your home now before you are missed. Act as if nothing has happened. We will be watching." Roland gestured to the door, and Thomas understood that he was dismissed. He started to leave, then turned back. "Sir, will it happen soon? Only last night he hurt my mother very badly, and I fear what might happen if he does it again." Roland's expression darkened. "We move quickly when we move. Now go." Thomas ran from the tavern, his heart lighter than it had been in years, despite the uncertainty of what he had set in motion. He returned home to find Roderick just waking, surly and hungover, and his mother trying to prepare breakfast, despite barely being able to stand. Thomas went about his morning chores, feeding the chickens and fetching water from the well, trying to act normally even though his insides were churning with nervous anticipation. The knights, true to Roland's word, began their investigation immediately. They were experienced in the art of gathering information without being noticed. The grey-bearded knight, whose name was Marcus, spent time in the tavern, listening to gossip about Roderick. What he heard confirmed Thomas's story. The tanner was known as a cruel drunk, quick with his fists, particularly toward women and children. Several people mentioned how Eleanor had changed since marrying him, how the light had gone out of her. The tavern keeper himself, a jovial man named John, spoke in hushed tones about how Roderick often boasted about beating his wife into submission, how he enjoyed having power over someone weaker than himself. Meanwhile, another knight, the dark-haired one called Simon, positioned himself where he could observe the tanner's cottage. He did not have to wait long to see evidence of Roderick's true nature. That very afternoon, he watched through a window as Roderick struck Eleanor across the face for some trivial matter, then shoved her to the floor. When Thomas tried to intervene, Roderick backhanded the boy, sending him sprawling. Simon's hand went to his sword, but he restrained himself. They had their code, and they would follow it properly. That evening, the Brotherhood gathered again in their room at the tavern to share what they had learned. The verdict was unanimous. Thomas had spoken the truth. Roderick was indeed a brutal man who terrorized his family. The question now was what to do about it. "We could simply kill him," suggested the red-bearded knight, a man called Hugh. "Slit his throat in an alley one night, clean and simple. No one would mourn him." But Roland shook his head. "That would make us no better than common assassins. We are the Brotherhood of the Road. We have our code. We seek justice, not mere revenge. Besides, killing him creates complications. Questions would be asked. The bailiff might actually bestir himself to investigate. The boy and his mother could be implicated." Marcus spoke up. "What if we drive him out? Give him such a beating that he is too afraid to ever return?" "Possible," Roland agreed. "But men like Roderick are like beaten dogs. Sometimes they slink away, but sometimes they come back twice as vicious, seeking revenge. We need a solution that is permanent but does not involve murder." Simon, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "I have an idea. It will require some acting on our part, and we will need to involve the bailiff, but I think it could work. We make it so that Roderick chooses to leave, and moreover, we make it so he can never return without facing dire consequences." He outlined his plan, and as the other knights listened, slow smiles spread across their weathered faces. It was clever, it was just, and it would solve the problem without creating new ones. Roland clapped Simon on the shoulder. "Well thought, brother. We will do it tomorrow." The next day dawned grey and cold. Roderick, as was his custom, spent the morning working at his tanning yard, treating hides with a mixture of urine and other chemicals that left him reeking. He returned home for his midday meal in a foul mood, the smell of the tannery clinging to him like a shroud. Eleanor had prepared a simple pottage, but it was not to Roderick's liking. He accused her of deliberately making it poorly, of trying to poison him, of being a worthless wife. His voice grew louder and louder, and Thomas, sitting in the corner, braced himself for what was coming. But before Roderick could strike the first blow, there came a thunderous knocking at the door. Roderick jerked it open, ready to unleash his anger on whoever dared disturb him, but his tirade died on his lips when he saw who stood there. Roland the Scarred, along with Marcus and Hugh, stood in the doorway in full armor, their swords at their sides, their expressions grim. "Roderick the Tanner?" Roland's voice was cold and formal. "You are to come with us, now." Roderick's face went through several rapid changes, from anger to confusion to fear. "What is this about? I have done nothing wrong. You have no authority here." We have been hired to bring you before the bailiff on charges of assault and wife-beating," Roland said, speaking loudly enough that several neighbors who had gathered at the sound of armored knights stopped by a common cottage could hear clearly. "You can come peacefully, or we can drag you. Choose now." Roderick looked past the knights to where Eleanor and Thomas stood. His eyes narrowed with suspicion and rage. "This is her doing, isn't it? That whining wench has been spreading lies about me, and that worthless boy. I will teach them both a lesson they will not forget." He took a step toward Eleanor, his fist raised, but he never completed the movement. Hugh moved with surprising speed for such a large man, his hand clamping down on Roderick's wrist like an iron shackle. You will teach no one anything today except perhaps yourself some manners, Hugh growled, twisting Roderick's arm behind his back. They marched Roderick through the village streets toward the bailiff's house, and a small crowd followed, eager to see what would happen. This was high entertainment in a town where little of interest usually occurred. Thomas and Eleanor followed at a distance, both terrified and hopeful in equal measure. The bailiff, a portly man named Geoffrey, was initially reluctant to get involved. Roderick was, as mentioned, something of a friend, or at least a drinking companion. But Roland presented the case with such cold precision, citing the testimony of multiple witnesses, including the tavern keeper, several neighbors who had heard Eleanor's screams, and even a midwife who had once tended to Eleanor's injuries and been told they came from falling downstairs, a common lie. Moreover, and this was the crucial part of Simon's plan, Roland presented evidence of something else entirely. One of the knights, it seemed, had discovered that Roderick had been cheating customers at his tanning business, using cheaper materials than he charged for, and keeping false accounts. This was not actually true, but the Brotherhood had spent the previous night carefully constructing false evidence, doctored accounts, and even planting testimony from a few people who were willing to claim they had been cheated, particularly when they were paid for their trouble. In medieval times, assault against one's wife was unfortunately often overlooked, but cheating customers and maintaining false accounts was serious business. It struck at the heart of trade and commerce, and guilds took such matters very seriously. The bailiff, faced with this evidence, and with prominent members of the community watching the proceedings, had little choice but to act. "Roderick the Tanner," Geoffrey intoned with as much official gravity as he could muster, "you stand accused of fraud and of bringing disrepute upon the Tanners' Guild. The penalty for such actions is severe. You are hereby banished from Ashford and forbidden to practice your trade within a day's journey of this town. Furthermore, you are required to return any dowry or goods you received upon your marriage to Eleanor, as you have proven yourself unworthy of that union. If you are found within the boundaries of this town after sunset tomorrow, you will be imprisoned and your property forfeit. Do you understand these terms?" Roderick's face had gone from red to purple. "This is outrageous. I demand to see the evidence. I demand to face my accusers. I have rights." Roland stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on the hilt of his sword. "You have the right to accept this judgment and leave with your life and what property you can carry, or you can dispute it and face trial by combat. I would be happy to serve as champion for those you have wronged. What say you?" Roderick looked at Roland's scarred face, at the cold promise of death in his eyes, and whatever courage he might have possessed evaporated. He knew he could not win against a trained knight in single combat. He would be cut down in moments. His shoulders slumped in defeat. "I will leave," he muttered. Then, raising his eyes with a flash of his old venom, he looked directly at Eleanor. "But know this, wife. I will remember this betrayal. Someday, somehow, I will return and make you pay for this humiliation." Before anyone else could react, Roland moved. In one smooth motion, he drew his sword and brought the flat of the blade down on Roderick's shoulder, not hard enough to wound, but hard enough to send the man stumbling to his knees. Roland's voice, when he spoke, was soft, but carried to every ear in the room. "Let me make something absolutely clear, Roderick. If you ever, and I mean ever, return to this town or come within sight of that woman or her son, I will hear of it. And when I hear of it, I will hunt you down wherever you hide, and I will make you wish I had simply killed you today. I will break every bone in your body slowly, one at a time, and leave you crippled and begging for death. The Brotherhood of the Road does not make idle threats. We make promises. Do you understand me?" Roderick, on his knees, looking up at the knight who loomed over him like an angel of vengeance, nodded frantically. Yes, I understand. I will go. I will never return." "Good. You have until sunset tomorrow. I suggest you start packing." They released Roderick, and he stumbled from the bailiff's house, his reputation in ruins, his livelihood destroyed, his power broken. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, whispering excitedly about what they had witnessed. Eleanor stood frozen, unable to quite believe that it was over. Thomas ran to her, and she embraced him, tears streaming down her face for the first time in months, but these were tears of relief and joy rather than pain and fear. Roland approached them, his fierce expression softening slightly. "You are free of him now. Make sure you collect any valuables from your home before he has a chance to take them. The bailiff's order gives you right to them." Eleanor looked up at the scarred knight, this terrifying man who had just saved her life. "How can I ever thank you? I have no money to pay you for what you have done." Roland glanced down at Thomas, who looked back at him with shining eyes. "Your son already paid us," he said. "He paid us with his courage in coming to ask for help when he had nowhere else to turn. That is payment enough." He started to turn away, then paused and looked back at Thomas. "You have a brave heart, boy. When you are older, if you wish to learn the way of the sword, to stand for those who cannot stand for themselves, seek out the brotherhood of the road. We can always use men of honor." Thomas nodded solemnly, understanding that he had just been given a tremendous honor, an invitation into a brotherhood of warriors. "I will, sir. Thank you. Thank you for giving me and my mother our lives back." The knight stayed in Ashford for one more night, partially to ensure that Roderick actually left, and partially to quietly spread the word of what would happen to anyone who thought to take advantage of Eleanor now that she was unmarried again. The next day, they watched from the village edge as Roderick, his possessions loaded on a mule cart, took the road leading east, away from Ashford, away from the life he had known. He looked back once, his face twisted with impotent rage. But then he turned forward and kept walking, becoming smaller and smaller until he disappeared over the horizon. With Roderick gone, Eleanor and Thomas began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. The cottage, which had been a place of fear and pain, gradually became a home again. Eleanor's bruises healed, and more importantly, the wounds in her spirit began to heal as well. The light returned to her eyes. Her smile, which Thomas had not seen in over a year, began to appear again, tentative at first, then more frequently. The village, which had turned a blind eye to Eleanor's suffering when Roderick was present, now rallied around her. The Guild of Tanners, embarrassed by the scandal Roderick had caused and moved by Eleanor's story, offered her a small pension. The blacksmith who had taken over her late husband William's shop hired Thomas as an apprentice, seeing in the boy his father's spirit. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to talk, to offer help, to share food. Eleanor took in mending and laundry work to supplement their income, and though life was not easy, it was peaceful. For the first time since his father had died, Thomas felt safe. Months passed and the seasons changed. Winter came, harsh and cold, and Thomas often thought of the Brotherhood of the Road, wondering where they were, if they were warm and safe. He thought of Roland especially, the scarred warrior who had shown mercy and justice in equal measure. Thomas began to train himself in secret, using a wooden sword he carved from a fallen branch, practicing the movements he had seen warriors use, dreaming of the day when he would be strong enough to join the Brotherhood and help others as they had helped him. Eleanor, for her part, slowly began to trust again. A widower from a neighboring village, a gentle carpenter named Peter, began courting her with old-fashioned courtesy and respect. He was patient, understanding that Eleanor had been wounded deeply and needed time. Thomas liked Peter and appreciated that the man never tried to take his father's place, but rather carved out his own space in their lives. 2 years after the Brotherhood had driven Roderick away, news came to Ashford that changed everything. A merchant travelling from the east brought word that Roderick the Tanner had been found dead in a town 3 days' journey away. He had, apparently, made the mistake of beating a tavern keeper's daughter. The girl's brothers, local men of some repute, had beaten Roderick nearly to death and thrown him out of town. He had died of his injuries on the road, alone and unmourned. When Eleanor heard the news, she felt nothing but a deep sense of relief. The last shadow hanging over her life had been lifted. Roderick could never return, not even in her nightmares. That spring, the Brotherhood of the Road passed through Ashford again. Thomas, now 12 years old and grown taller and stronger from his work as a blacksmith's apprentice, saw them riding into town and ran to greet them. Roland was there, as were Marcus, Hugh and Simon, along with a few new faces. When Roland saw Thomas, he dismounted and clasped the boy's shoulder in greeting. "Thomas, son of William, you have grown. How fares your mother?" "She is well, sir. She is to be married again in the summer, to a good man. We are happy. We are safe. Thanks to you and your brothers." Roland nodded, satisfied. "And you, boy? Are you still of a mind to join us someday?" Thomas gestured to his arms, showing muscles developed from working the forge. "I grow stronger every day. I practice with the sword as I can, and I remember what you did for us. I remember that when power is used rightly, it can protect the weak rather than crush them. When I am old enough, when I am skilled enough, I will seek you out. I want to be like you. I want to help people who have no one else." Roland smiled, a rare expression on his scarred face. "Then I look forward to that day, young Thomas. The world needs more who would stand for justice rather than simply for profit. Until then, grow strong, learn your craft, and remember that true strength is not in the arm, but in the heart." The Brotherhood stayed in Ashford for only one night before moving on, as was their way. But before they left, Roland gave Thomas a gift. A small dagger of good steel, well balanced and sharp. "Every warrior needs his first blade," Roland said. "Treat it with respect, use it wisely, and remember that the greatest victory is the one where no blood needs to be spilled." Thomas treasured that dagger, keeping it oiled and sharp, wearing it at his belt as a reminder of the knights who had saved him and his mother. It was a symbol of hope and justice, a promise that even in a dark world there were those who would stand against cruelty and defend the helpless. Years continued to pass. Thomas grew into a young man, skilled at the forge, strong in body and sound in mind. Eleanor married Peter the carpenter, and they were happy together, a gentle love built on respect and kindness. Thomas never forgot the Brotherhood of the Road, and when he turned 18, he kept his promise. He said farewell to his mother and stepfather, who blessed his choice, and set out to find Roland and the Brotherhood. It took him 6 months of traveling from town to town, following rumors and stories, but eventually he found them in a city to the north. Roland, now older with more grey in his hair, but still formidable, welcomed Thomas into the Brotherhood. The boy who had once been helpless became a knight sworn to protect others. He learned the code of the Brotherhood, which valued justice over law, mercy over cruelty, and courage over all else. He learned that true knighthood was not about noble birth or rich armor, but about the choices one made when faced with wrongdoing. Thomas became known throughout the land as a fair and just warrior, one who particularly championed the causes of women and children suffering under the hands of cruel men. He never forgot where he had come from, never forgot the desperate boy who had walked into a tavern and begged strangers for help. And whenever he helped someone in need, whenever he stood between the weak and those who would harm them, he remembered Roland's words, "The greatest victory is the one where no blood needs to be spilled." The story of how a small boy begged knights to kill his stepfather and how those knights chose a better path became something of a legend in the region. It was told in taverns and around firesides, a reminder that justice could still be found in a hard world, that courage came in all sizes, and that sometimes the greatest warriors were those who knew when not to kill. Eleanor, in her cottage with her kind husband, would sometimes hear travellers telling the story, not knowing that the boy in the tale was her son, and she would smile, grateful beyond measure for the day Thomas had found the courage to ask for help, and for the knights who had answered his plea with wisdom rather than simple violence. And so Thomas lived his life as a knight of the Brotherhood of the Road, traveling from place to place, helping those who could not help themselves, standing firm against tyranny and cruelty, and always remembering the lesson he had learned that autumn day when he was 10 years old. That true strength lies not in the ability to hurt others, but in the courage to protect them, and that justice, when pursued with honor and wisdom, can change the world one small village at a time. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a like and subscribe to the History's Medieval channel for more tales of honor, courage, and justice from ages past. I would also love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me, if you had been in Thomas's position, what would you have done? Would you have had the courage to ask those warriors for help, or would you have tried to solve the problem differently? Share your thoughts, and let's start a conversation about bravery and justice in the comments section. Your engagement helps this channel grow and allows me to bring you more stories like this one. Until next time, may you find courage when you need it, and may justice always prevail in your life.